Welcome, everyone. My name is Wes Williams. I'm the Director of Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities here at the University of Oxford. Torch is an engine room for interdisciplinary research and also for the development of new forms of public engagement. And within that frame, we have developed the Humanities Cultural Programme, one of the founding stones of the new Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities. I'm delighted to welcome you here today for this In Conversation event as part of our new Japan season. Japanese culture has made many different and significant contributions to the world, and this is both enacted and reflected in the diverse ways in which it is studied and researched here at the university. Performance, art and culture, alongside the rich histories, literatures and languages of Japan, will all form part of the Japan season which we've curated here over the next few months in Oxford. Led by Torch as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme, the Japan season is grounded in collaboration and celebration, showcasing the work of a range of creative performers and artists and collaborating with organisations which operate at a local, national and international level. We aim to reach audiences not only in Oxford but around the world. Oxford is then alive with opportunities to celebrate Japan, including a major exhibition hosted at the Ashmolean. Tokyo Art and Photography has recently opened and will be with us until the beginning of next year, so you can book your tickets now up until January 2022. We are then delighted to share the following In Conversation event coming to you from within the gallery itself. We'd like to extend our thanks to the Ashmolean for supporting this as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme Japan season. And all I need to do now is to hand over to Lena Fritsch, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Ashmolean, who'll be able to tell you more. Thank you so much for watching.
Welcome everyone to our In Conversation event, our digital In Conversation event, here at the Ashmolean Museum in the Tokyo Art and Photography exhibition. My name is Lena Fritsch. I'm the Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and I'm delighted to be here with Enrico Isamu Oyama and with Jason Waite. Enrico is a contemporary artist with Japanese and Italian background. He works in various artistic mediums, mostly abstract, and he often features a motif that he has titled quick turn structure, and that you will tell us a bit more about in a minute. And his work has been inspired by aerosol writing of the 1970s and 80s, particularly New York, but also other big urban centers. So welcome, Enrico. I should also say that you've grown up in Tokyo, but you've actually lived for quite a while in New York as well. So, and at the moment, you are mostly in Tokyo, so that fits wonderfully with our exhibition. Jason is an independent curator. He is also here at the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford. And thank you so much for coming today. I thought it's really interesting to hear your views on contemporary art as well, particularly because you have curated many interesting exhibitions, often also in areas of crisis. And thank you, both of you, for coming and agreeing to do this In Conversation here. I should say that I said we are in the Tokyo Art and Photography exhibition, but as you can see in the background, we are just at the very beginning. We are still installing, and Enrico's work that you can see in the background is actually not finished yet. And maybe we can start talking about the work that we see, the half-finished work. Enrico, can you tell me a bit more about this particular work that we see here in the background?
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Lena. My work is based on this black and white abstract shape, which I call quick turn structure. And I express this motif, quick turn structure, or QTS, in various mediums. And this work is mural version of a quick turn structure, and sometimes I work directly on the wall using aerosol paint or sumi ink, But sometimes I use digital technology to realize it. And then this work is actually, I made a drawing on paper first and digitize it on computer and then print it on vinyl sticker. So it's actually a vinyl, adhesive vinyl pasted on the wall. I think there are two characteristics in this work, which is, the first one is that it actually responds to the structure of the building and specifically designed for this exhibition, and it lives only during the period of exhibition. So after the show, it's going to be removed. But at the same time, the second thing is that although this is kind of site-specific work, it was created remotely in Japan. So it has these two aspects of like being site-specific, but at the same time it can be transported. And I think this nature of the work originates from how the street art painted on subway trains in New York City, it traveled across the different neighborhoods of the city. So this nature of being transported across the different areas, I think it's also realized in this work, in my own way, I think. Yeah.
And you just said that the work was made in Japan. So because you often you work with a particular company that creates these vinyl works for you, because you're very particular. It has to be, of a certain quality standard and has to be a certain material and has to have a certain look as well. And it's actually a work that is part of a series in the sense that you create many of these quick turn structure works. It's also titled Figurati and then has a number. Could you tell us a bit more about Figurati?
Yes, the term Figurati is my own invention. I created this term, and it also has two meanings. One is it's a kind of twist of the spelling of graffiti. And it also has a connotation of Italian word figurati, which means, I think in English it would be figure it yourself or something like that.
Figure it out.
Yeah. So my intention here is to say I created my own visual language, which is quick turn structure, twisting the visual of aerosol writing or graffiti. So this is also reflected in the term figurati. It's kind of twist of the graffiti and figure it yourself. So kind of invent your own figure or language, whatever.
Because it's always abstract. Right?
Yeah. So regular graffiti is about writing your name in the street. So it's basically it's about letter forms. It's about like expressing yourself through the shape of letters. However, I removed the letter shapes and then extracted only the motion of lines and repeat it to compose an abstract shape. So yes, it's very abstract and black and white very often, yes. And so the quick turn structure is basically, it's the name of the motif or the shape which exists across all my works. And so it's like one ideal kind of motif. However, figurati refers to each individual pieces that physically exist, and they are numbered in the order of their creation.
Right. And perhaps it might be nice to just go back a little bit. But could you tell us a bit more about how you actually became interested in aerosol writing and graffiti art, and how did you start?
I was a high school student in Japan around like early 2000s, and around that time, like street culture from New York and from also other like cities like London or Paris, Berlin also. Street culture was very like popular among young people in Japan. I was naturally, as one of high school students, I was also into it. And I have friends who are doing DJ, breakdancing, things like that. And I liked drawing since my childhood. So I picked street art as my thing. And I started drawing on paper first and then shifted to doing live paintings in music events, things like that. That's how it started.
Right, it has been a long journey.
Yeah, it's been close to 20 years now doing this thing. Yeah.
Could you talk about the relationship between the form and the space? Like, you spoke about the influence of New York in the 70s and 80s, and stylistically, the work has a reminiscence of wild style through its angularity and through its curves. And part of this notion is not only the style, but also the placement. And in New York in the 70s and 80s was a profoundly bankrupt city, economically depressed. And in the Bronx, which was largely a migrant neighborhood, as well as a neighborhood which was very diverse, started to utilize space in a way of appropriation. So the notion of not only, as you said, putting one's name out there as an early form of social media in a way, but also this notion of kind of the ruins of the city and how to appropriate and use those ruins of the city. And yet Tokyo in the early 2000s, it's a very different urban landscape. And I'm curious how you considered the relationship of space in your work and its development.
That's a very important point, actually. And actually, that really kind of, that point defined my direction of my art practice when I started this. So I was influenced by, as you said, New York graffiti, but the social context was very different. And I did street graffiti a few times, but then I questioned myself, like, do I really need to put my name, like, illegally in the street to demonstrate it to the public? People who started this culture, they didn't have other meanings to express themselves, maybe, because of the situation they were in. But I was from middle-class Japanese family, and I went to private high school. You know, I was in a very different social and economic background. So, however, there was also the fact that I was simply influenced by this culture, and I liked it, and I was so attracted to the visual of the culture. So I was kind of, I had a conflict between these two things, and I was like, should I do this? Should I keep this doing? So there was a moment that I was having conflict, struggling about that when I was a high school student or in my early 20s, let's say. But then I kind of decided to digest this influence, and I invented my own language, which was abstract, the quick tone structure. And then it became more like, it became for me more purely kind of formalistic issue. So when I make painting, for example, there's this tension between the shape, the QTS, and the frame of the painting. And that's the kind of pure form of how I think about the layout or composition between the motif and then the frame. But this can be said also for the mural, for example. For example, this piece, you know, there's this block thing on the wall over there, and you know, there are a lot of elements on the wall. I mean, it looks like simple white wall, but if I actually work on this wall, there are a lot of elements which I have to think to compose the shape of QTS. So there's always this dialogue between the environment or context. This can be physical context or social or institutional context. And between the context and my work, there's always dialogue or negotiation between them. And I think in the beginning, in the New York, maybe this was more about how to place the name in the street. But in my practice, it can be more abstract sometimes, like in the painting on canvas or in the museum walls, or of course in more like street environment. It can be both, yeah.
What I find really interesting about your work is also that you are, you're not only an artist, but you've actually written quite a lot about graffiti and about aerosol art and about actually, kind of international graffiti art in New York and in Japan. And how does that actually influence your own artistic practice, do you think? To have all that kind of intellectual background and to know all that, about the whole history of the medium.
Yeah, I began writing about street art because the recognition of this culture in Japan was very little, 20 years ago. So people knew Jean-Michel Basquiat or Keith Haring, but that was it. And now people know Banksy. But very kind of only cliche recognition was there when I started. And there was also some sort of expectation to street art or graffiti to kind of like destroy the institution of art. Yeah. And some people kind of played a role in that way, but I was like, what I wanted to do was a little different, and I wanted to kind of convey the more deep possibility of street art and diverse possibility of street art. So I kind of started writing, and of course, doing both things, like making actual work and then writing and thinking about street art. They are interwoven in my practice, so they influence each other and make a great dynamism for me. Yeah.
Well, we've already talked about Tokyo a little bit. Maybe we can talk a bit more about the city. And of course, because this is also a Tokyo exhibition. So maybe a question for both of you. What is your relationship or your personal, relationship with the city of Tokyo?
I was born and raised in Japan, Tokyo, always, and I grew up there until I was 27, and then I moved to New York, but I spent most of my life in Tokyo, Japan, so that's my relation. Yeah.
I grew up in the United States, and actually my first trip to Tokyo was not so long after the Great East Japan earthquake. And my first experience in Tokyo was landing in Tokyo and meeting Chimpam, who I had met previously in New York. And we immediately went up to Fukushima the next day. And Tokyo, for me, has always been mediated by those two important elements. One, the artistic scene, which I feel very close to, and the other, Fukushima and the underlying structure of Tokyo. What is it that makes Tokyo live and function, and how are there places outside of the city and internationally that undergird the city itself?
Yeah, interesting. And how would you both describe Tokyo to people who haven't been to Tokyo, maybe? So there will probably be visitors in this exhibition who, would like to go to Tokyo and who are maybe even hoping to go for the Olympics and now they can't go. So how would you describe the city? It's quite difficult because it's a very diverse city.
Yes. I think Tokyo is a big city. Also in terms of the land, it covers a lot of areas. So and then it has multiple centers. So that makes the city even more complicated, I think. And the subway system. I mean, I tend to be attracted to subways. Subway system, I think it's very impressive. And on the surface, it's very clean city, but in the depths, it's very complicated and very so many layers that form the city. So I think that's something interesting.
It's very multi-layered. I think I would say that too. And very complex city, isn't it? And the subway system for sure is, I mean, for me, it's probably one of the best that I've ever encountered. Yeah.
And also, I think that distribution is so fascinating. Kind of living in New York, the issue where many artists live in certain areas in the city. And in Tokyo, artists live everywhere. It's quite shocking. And I think that shows the world upon worlds. And what does it mean to know a city that can be turned in infinite ways and can be addressed in infinite spaces and through intimate social experiences as well. It seems like a deeply complex city and one which is also overlapping in time. It's so shocking coming from the US how one can turn from a cafe and run into a shrine or turn from a shopping mall and run into a small house. And I think these overlapping and entangled timelines also make it a very special place.
That's true, yeah. I think Japan is one of the very few countries that has been influenced by, has been part of Asia for a long time. And of course, it's still part of Asia. But at the same time, it was one of the first countries in Asia that was modernized and influenced by Western countries, and they imported a lot of Western influence and mixture of it. And they still coexist, new and old Westernist in not just Tokyo maybe, but especially in Tokyo, I think it's very, it's visible, I guess, yeah.
And it's a really fast-paced city, of course, and a fast-changing city, which I think is it's one of our main themes in this exhibition is also what we call destruction and renewal. So how the city constantly redevelops and changes, and how it also is reborn so often after earthquakes and after the extreme destruction after the Second World War. And I think that's something, and of course urban redevelopment in general, and it's a very, as we already said, it's a very complex city also because some areas have been kind of planned, but there are also many areas that actually were not really planned. And so you have, as you said, you have the cafe right next to the temple and then the skyscraper in the background, and it's all kind of somehow comes together in this wonderful dynamic way. Before we talk a bit more about destruction and renewal, I just wanted to come back to the art scene in Tokyo, because Jason already said it's actually interesting that unlike, for example, in New York, where maybe most artists live in Brooklyn or, I don't know, in Berlin, everyone is kind of in the Neukölln area or so. But in Tokyo, actually, people are in different areas. Is that right? That's kind of my experience.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
What do you think, would you say is the kind of biggest misconception about, the contemporary art scene in Japan, and particularly in Tokyo?
I think Japan or Tokyo is known for few certain things. Traditionally, maybe something like geisha, Fujiyama kind of thing, cultural kind of icon of Japan, these things. And then more recently, I think it's known for manga, anime, so-called otaku culture kind of thing, which is great, and I think it's definitely one of the unique contemporary Japanese cultures. But obviously, it doesn't represent everything, and especially in terms of contemporary art, contemporary art is a practice of to reflect the complexity of the society. So, of course, it does not fit into one style or one category. So, there are certain artists who employ the language of otaku culture, of course, and that's fine. But there are so many other things too. And I think, especially after 3/11, the landscape has changed because, I mean, not just in the realm of art, but in Japanese society itself, I think a lot of things has changed since 3/11. And of course, now after the COVID pandemic, I think it will change again. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of different diverse practices in Japanese contemporary art scene.
Well, 3/11, I should say, for those of you who are, I mean, for us, we all know what this means, but it refers to the nuclear disaster in Fukushima in March 2011. And otaku, the word that Enrico was using, is kind of refers to, well, it means stay at home. So it's kind of a kind of geek culture, if you will, of often people who stay a lot at home and kind of living in a manga, anime kind of world.
Yeah.
Is that a good description?
I think so.
Very nerdy, very nerdy.
Nerdy, yeah.
But it's a part of Japanese kind of popular culture that was elevated and used a lot in the art world. Well, it has been for the last 20, 30 years,
something like that,
I'd say.
yeah.
Yeah.
And Lena, what's your relationship to the city? And also, how have you seen the city change over time in relationship
Yeah,
to
so my
3/11?
relationship is, well, I lived in Osaka actually as a child. So for me, my first relationship with Japan is actually not the Kanto region, but the Kansai region, which has its own culture and quite a different character from Tokyo. It's kind of the media center in Japan, and kind of a city of theater and comedy as well. So it has a really different vibe compared to Tokyo. And then my first encounter with Tokyo was as a teenager, and I really fell in love with the city and wanted to really live there. That was in the 90s. And then I moved there when I was 19 and lived in Tokyo for 6 months. And so for me, it's really kind of associated with, becoming an adult, my first flat, a tiny, tiny little flat. I think it was 11 square meters, if I'm not wrong, including everything, including a wonderful little bathtub, made of plastic, those ones that are kind of pre-created before they actually, they kind of make them and like mold them, and then they just go into the flat. And then, I lived there again as a student, and then again as a PhD student. So it's a kind of a city that has fascinated me for a long time. But also a city where, when I lived there for a while, I realized it's probably not for me, because it's just, I get a bit claustrophobic, I think. But also, whenever I then come back from Tokyo, I just miss how everything works so well in Japan, So, therefore, this exhibition is very close to my heart, to do something about Tokyo and the vibrancy of Tokyo. And I love the art scene. There's so many fantastic artists there, many of whom are also not so well known here. So I really kind of want to, introduce people to the wide range of art in Tokyo. Yeah. And what I find interesting about the city is also what we mentioned before, is this aspect of constant, renewal and constant change. And to come back to your question about how it has changed, it definitely, when I was there in the 90s, it felt more futuristic. I think that's, it was really kind of the megalopolis. That has changed a bit. It has aged a little bit. But that's also really nice. It's a, nice character of the city as well. And it doesn't always feel as cutting edge anymore as maybe some Asian cities now do. kind of 90s Tokyo is something that I quite like. There's some of these cafes or so that still reflect that atmosphere of 90s Tokyo. Yeah. What would you say? How has it changed over the years?
I was born in 1983, and I personally never had an impression that Tokyo was futuristic.
But that's because you grew up there, I think.
Maybe, or I don't know, I understand people say Tokyo is futuristic, and if someone says so, I feel like maybe yes. But I never thought in that way spontaneously in myself. So I'm also interested in how non-Japanese people or people who grew up outside of Japan or Tokyo, like even Japanese people who grew up outside of Tokyo, how do they perceive Tokyo? I'm kind of interested in that, yeah, because I grew up there and I cannot see it objectively, you know. Like how you perceive it in terms of like, I know in 80s maybe Japanese technology was something like people think Japan is a country of technology, things like that. But now I think it's not like that anymore. But maybe in 80s and 90s there was a kind of perception like that from non-Japanese people. Would you say so?
Yeah, and I think it's also fascinating also in relationship to New York and Tokyo, just the kind of different trajectories of the city and how I was speaking about the kind of economic decline of New York in the 70s and 80s. And this is a time of real economic boom in Japan. And so the relationship to the notion of modernity is also on such a different track and such a different timeline. And it feels for me, going there now, as though there was an alternative modernity that happened in a different universe and that coexists with us today. And I think one example for me that's always very striking is the subway ticket machines. And the subway ticket machines in New York or even London are very flat, and there's kind of one entry point and there is about one exit point, and you kind of touch various forms. And coming to a subway ticket machine in Tokyo, I didn't even realize what it was. It looked as though it was a robot that had been ripped open and its various insides were all on display, and also looked somewhat threatening. I mean, there are many moving parts where it looks like t-shirts could get caught in and you could get dragged in. And so there's a different notion of what and how one relates with even the quotidian in Tokyo, which I find very fascinating.
We already touched upon the whole, destruction and renewal theme, and I would like to come back to that a little bit, particularly also in relation to the work. So as you already mentioned, the work will of course be destroyed, will be gone after the exhibition. And that was also a reason why we thought it's really interesting to have your work in this show, because it is a show about a city that's constantly changing and where often things are destroyed and then something new is built again. So what is your kind of relationship to, that idea of ephemerality and of constant change, which is an important part of your work, because many of your mural works, at least, they exist for a certain period of time in a certain space, and then they're either gone if they're in an exhibition, or, of course, there are also works that you've created for outside spaces where then another graffiti artist comes and creates something on top of it or so.
Right, yeah. That happened in Berlin, actually, yeah, which I liked, because it was some sort of unofficial collaboration. I take it in that way, actually. So I think ephemerality, I was never conscious about it, actually, but it exists in my practice, yes. And for me, again, this relates to the concept of quick turn structure and figurati. So physical works, figurati is term for each individual piece that physically exists. And some of them are on canvas intended to last for a long time, but some of them ephemeral, like this piece here. But the idea of quick-turn structure and its realization throughout my practice, it exists in a different layer, I guess. And that's the core of my practice and the value of my practice or work, I guess. So, yeah, some individual pieces they will be gone after a while, but it does not mean their value will be lost because they are physically gone. When they are created, they already contribute to my practice, the continuation of my practice with quick-turn structure. So, of course, for some contexts, it's important to keep the work physically strong and then make them durable for a long time in certain contexts. But in the big picture, I think the important thing is how to prove the multifaceted possibility of quick-turn structure through each individual pieces. And ephemerality is part of that aspect. And yeah, so I think I think in that way. Yeah.
And Jason, you've done co-curated a really interesting exhibition, Don't Follow the Wind, in 2015, which opened in Fukushima, in a kind of, in the, how do you call that area, nuclear zone. And it's basically an exhibition that is there. It opened in 2015, but people can't access it. So the works in the space must be changing, must be, kind of gradually, being destroyed maybe by the wind or kind of, withering, if that's the right word. So could you tell us a bit more about that kind of concept? Because that's also, if we think about, the destruction of works or kind of the short-lived nature of some works, it's a really interesting concept, I think.
Yeah, it's such an important part of the show and such an important part of existence in Japan, as you noted, in relationship to natural disasters and long history of earthquakes and tsunami. And yet Fukushima, the meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station was not a natural disaster, as the independent and government report said. It was very much a human-made disaster. And a human-made disaster which has a host of historical and present entanglements. There were American-made nuclear reactors on the site, and it was run not by the Fukushima Power Company, but it was run by Tokyo Electric Power Company. So the notion that all of the energy that was being produced was actually servicing the city itself. So the disaster has a very strong relationship to a city which is 200 kilometers away. And yet Fukushima, which is the name of the power plant, but also the name of a large prefecture, has long had a very contentious relationship with the city. And I think here in the UK, it helps us think about the Midlands' relationship to London, for example, or the North's relationship to London, and this very extractive relationship that's happened, extractive of both resources, but also bodies. And that seems very much the same with Fukushima in Tokyo. And so the exhibition, as Lena said, opened in the Fukushima exclusion zone, which is a 337 square kilometer area right next to the nuclear power plant that melted down, but that covered 7 towns. And parts of those towns were forcibly evacuated, and over 100,000 people were forcibly evacuated. And now there's about 25,000 that have been separated from their homes since 2011. So it was just the 10th anniversary this year of this ongoing disaster. And so we've collaborated with a number of those people who have been displaced. And they are hosting in their homes and places of work that they can no longer live in 12 projects by artists and collective from both Japan, in the case of Chimpom or Meru Koizumi or Kota Takeuchi, or also international artists such as Trevor Paglin or Ai Weiwei or Taryn Simon. And all of these artists have created new works that are specific for these places. And these places are inside a zone which the public can't get access to. So the works are there, they're open, but nobody can visit the works yet, and there's no known timeline when that will happen, years or decades. So what can a work do while being there without an audience? We've all had those experiences over COVID of exhibitions that have opened and waited. And in Fukushima, this waiting is perhaps a bit longer than the rest. And what becomes very interesting is as the radioactive particles decay, their energy is on a very clear trajectory. But the artwork's trajectory is so different. For example, when is the right time to see an artwork? Is it when the artwork is first installed? Is it while the artwork is going through a process of decay? Is it the remnant of the artwork? In this sense, the artwork always encapsulates all of these timelines at the same moment. And so while the radioactivity is declining, art and culture is maintaining its potency. And we hope at some point in time that audience will be able to come and see the show.
I think that is really interesting concept. And there's this idea of time there about, as you said, when is the right timing to see the artwork. And I think I want to ask a question. I don't know if there's the end of that project, but if the show is over at some point, is it possible to take one or two pieces from that exhibition, from the Don't Throw the Window exhibition, and put with other artworks in a different group show? Like recurate the pieces in that project as another project. Would that be possible? Or because I think, for example, this museum, it has a lot of traditional artworks in a collection, but also do contemporary art shows, and they mixed all the new stuff, which is maybe like a Tokyo, I don't know. So I think this issue of time is in the context of art. I think it's also about recreating the time, combining different artworks that originally belongs to different timeline. But when they are put together, there's another sphere of time created within that exhibition. So yeah, I was just wondering if that can be said to that project, your project in Fukushima.
We don't know.
Yeah.
in a sense, like, it's very interesting, and maybe to some degree a bit like how street art functions out in the urban environment. One doesn't know what's going to happen to it once it's there, and yet we try to care for the works and we try to maintain the works, and so there is this balance of what are the networks of care that form around artworks, and what happens when those are in irradiated spaces or forcibly displaced spaces. In a way, one can try one's best, but nobody can live there. There can't be temperature controls like this room. There's not a foundation, for example. It's just us, artists and curators running. So this notion of duration becomes very interesting. It could perhaps only continue perhaps as long as it's cared for, question mark. Or can it also outlive all of us, even in its absence or even in its degraded state? These are questions that we didn't necessarily know we would have at the beginning of the project in 2012. And how do you feel about work in public space as well? It's something which, like, you've thought about this work within a context which is highly controlled and which you can also know the parameters of and hopefully know the future of. How do you think about working in public space?
Do you mean my own work? Yes. Yeah, as you said, sometimes I don't know neither. But for example, for this work, it's clear that it's going to be removed after the show ends. But sometimes, for example, my mural work that I created for Aichi Triennale 2010, the first Aichi Triennale, I created a massive mural in Chojamachi area, which is in the center of Nagoya city. And it was supposedly removed after the show was over. But the local people liked it, so they decided to keep the mural, and it's still there after 10 years. But of course, it's getting damaged after 10 years. So it looks very different from the beginning. But it's still there. So the plan has changed, and it still exists. Sometimes, like the Berlin mural that I made in 2013, I painted with permission. But it was painted over someone's graffiti under it. So those local graffiti artists, they didn't like it. So they came back and I painted over my mural afterwards, maybe a year after or something. And it still exists in that condition after 7-8 years. So it's the matter of who is the creator of the work, or who is the, who is the author of the work. It's a matter of authorship also. The landscape of that mural in Berlin, there's this concrete wall, and there's some anonymous graffiti around it, small ones, and there's this original graffiti, and then there's another layer of my mural over it, and there's the newest graffiti on top of my mural, but that was also done a few years ago. So now maybe there's more element on that wall, and what's the frame of the artwork there? It's part of landscape maybe, but it's not natural landscape. It was human-made to some extent because I painted it by my hand. So there's this kind of, border issue always. What's the border of the artwork? And it can be said to some extent to all type of public street artworks, I guess. Yeah.
I think the multi-layered aspect is really interesting, because that links again very nicely to our exhibition as well, and to Tokyo. And although, yes, your work will disappear after this exhibition, but the question is, how will it disappear? Because I'm not sure, we might have to paint over it, so it might still be, technically, it might still be there, although people can't see it, which would also be quite interesting. And who knows, maybe visitors will come and say, no, it should stay, and then
or
it can stay.
When it's being peeled off, you can film it. Mm-hmm. So the process of being destroyed is recorded. Mm-hmm. So it exists in a different format, right, as video. Mm-hmm. So that can be said it still exists, maybe.
Right. Well, maybe that's a good way to end our in-conversation. So thank you to both of you so much. And to all visitors who haven't seen the exhibition yet, please come and visit. The exhibition is on until the 3rd of January. and has works from over 400, or actually no, exactly kind of 400 years from Tokyo, but also from Edo, which is the name of the city before it was named Tokyo. And we have works from all kinds of different artists, including Enrico Isamu Oyama, but also some artists that Jason mentioned. We have a work by Chimpom, we have a work by Koizumi Meiro, and by very many other artists. So please come and join us. Oh, and actually, if you have questions, there is going to be a little live chat section. So if you have questions, please just ask them and we will try to get back to you very soon. Thanks, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.